You're listening to the Dibbly Dobbly Podcast. Remember to like, share, comment, subscribe, and click the bell to make sure you get the latest episodes of the podcast. Be sure to like and share our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and on Instagram. Hi everyone and welcome back to another episode of the Dibbly Dobbly Podcast. On today's episode of the podcast, we review the Test series between Australia and the West Indies. It's the Dibbly Dobbly Podcast, and let's get started. Let's have a look at the series results from the Test series between Australia and the West Indies. The first Test was played at the Perth Stadium. Australia won by 164 runs. Marnus Labuschagne was named Player of the Match. The second and final Test match of the series was played at the Adelaide Oval. Australia won by 419 runs. Travis Head was named Player of the Match. Australia won the series 2-0 and Marnus Labuschagne was named Player of the Series. Let's have a look at Australia's performance with both bat and ball in this Test series against the West Indies and talk about their performance in the Test series overall. Australia dominated this series in all three departments, with bat, ball and in the field. 2-0 series win will boost their confidence going into the South Africa Test series, which is coming up very shortly. But the important thing for Australia is that their batters and bowlers are peaking at the right time ahead of the Test series against South Africa. And I think all the batters and all the bowlers will be very pleased with their performance and how they performed in this series across the board. Let's talk about Australia's batting and let's have a look at their batting performance throughout this series against the West Indies. Marnus Labuschagne was the leading run scorer for Australia in the series with the bat, 502 runs, Head 312, Smith 255, Khawaja 178, Warner 102, Carey 49 and Green 14. That's how the Australian batters performed with the bat in this Test series against Australia. Australia's batting in this series was dominant. They did the basics well with the bat. They built partnerships nicely. They rotated the strike well. They punished the bad balls. They put the pressure back onto the West Indian bowlers. And it was a really clinical batting performance across the whole series. In particular, the top order scoring runs, which is a good sign, obviously. The middle order not really having much of a hit throughout this series. Cameron Green, Alex Carey only had 2 innings in this series with the bat, and that was in the second Test in Adelaide. Whereas in the first Test, it was pretty much Labuschagne, Head, Smith, Khawaja, and David Warner who pretty much did all the work. So that's good signs for Australia that the top order building partnerships, setting the foundation for the team to really cash in and get big scores. Now, throughout this series, Australia's partnerships have been very good, and it's a good sign going into the South Africa series that the partnerships are being consistent, and there are big partnerships there as well. So in the first Test match, 142, 251 and 196 were the partnerships that were over 100 plus or 50 plus. The second Test match, 95, 297, 77 and 58. So, once again, pretty good partnerships across the 2 Test matches. So, overall, Australia had 400-run partnerships and 250-run partnerships. So, that's an indication of the top order really converting the partnerships into a good start to even a better start in terms of bigger partnerships and looking to build the partnership and increase it. So what we judge from those stats is that the partnerships that Australia have built have been pretty good. It shows the top order are digging in, scoring runs, building partnerships, and getting on with the job in terms of converting 50-run partnerships into big 100-run partnerships. As we've seen in this series, we've had a couple of 250-plus partnerships from Australia. 251 in the first Test, that was Smith and Labuschagne for the third wicket, and 297 between Head and Labuschagne for the fourth wicket in the second Test in Adelaide. So that's good to see from Australia. It showed that all the batters are doing their job and scoring runs. And yes, it was against a West Indian attack that was weakened, undermanned, lacked the potency, lacked pace. But the Australian batters, they had to face the bowlers that were presented to them, and they were able to cash in and convert the scores into big scores. As we've seen in this series, a couple of double hundreds, obviously, from Labuschagne and Smith. Travis Head got 175 in the second Test in Adelaide. So it shows that the Australian batters are in good touch, good form. all good signs going into the South Africa series, which is coming up shortly. Also, Australia scored big scores in this series. 4 for 598 declared in the first Test match, followed by 2 for 182 declared in the first Test match as well. The second Test, 7 for 511 declared and 6 for 199 declared. So that just shows that Australia's batting, they're posting big scores in the first innings and really putting the opposition under pressure. So that's good signs for Australia that they're scoring big runs in the first innings. First innings runs are so important in a Test match to really set you up to do well in the Test match and hopefully go on to win it. As we've seen in this series from Australia, they were able to put the West Indian bowlers under pressure. They were able to cash in, score big runs in the first innings, which did set the 2 Test matches up nicely for Australia in terms of winning both of them by big margins. Let's talk about some of the batters that performed in this series. Marnus Labuschagne, 502 runs in the series, simply outstanding. The way he batted in this series was superb. Career best form. He dominated this series from ball 1 in Perth. The 2 centuries that he got in Perth was superb. The double century in the first innings, then the century in the second innings. He also scored 1 in Adelaide, 163 in the first innings of the second Test in Adelaide. Had a superb series, 300s. Good signs for him going into the South Africa series that he's scoring runs, and Australia are very glad to see that, obviously, and I think many Australian supporters are glad to see that from Marnus Labuschagne. He's going to be a very good player in the future for Australia. 3,000 Test runs already. It's the second fastest in terms of reaching 3,000 Test runs in a Test career. Only Don Bradman's ahead of him, of course. Obviously, Bradman's the top of the list for every batting record in the game. But, for Marnus, it's just good to see him in good form. Steve Smith had a pretty good series. Also in the first Test match, got 200 not out. Great signs for Australia that Steve Smith is back, looking good, scoring runs. Travis Head had a fantastic series, 175 in the second Test in Adelaide, his home ground. He was able to score a century at his home ground in a Test match at the Adelaide Oval, which was a brilliant moment for him. Missed out in Perth, got 99 in the first innings in Perth in the first Test, but he was able to cash in Adelaide. I think Travis Head has really found his role in this Australian Test side to come in at number 5 and be the aggressor, play with freedom, play your way. He's certainly grown with confidence throughout the whole series, Travis Head. So it's good to see him scoring runs and looking comfortable at the crease and really belonging to this Australian Test side. Usman Khawaja had a pretty good series, 178 runs at an average of 44.5. That's pretty good. Khawaja class as always. Yes, he didn't score a century, but he scored a couple of half centuries, which is good from Usman Khawaja. David Warner had a pretty underwhelming series, 102 runs, average of 25.5, highest score of 48. As we know with David Warner, there's been a lot of outside noise. It's been well documented. With all that, we all know the reasons for that. We're not going to go into that now. But he's struggling with that and trying to deal with that. Hopefully for Australia that he can turn things around for the South Africa series. Cameron Green looked a bit shaky in the second Test in Adelaide, averaging 7 in the series, high score of 9. As I said, Cameron Green's a young player. He'll learn from this experience. Maybe the lack of first-class preparation was a bit of a factor in terms of him not really batting well in the second Test in Adelaide. But hopefully for Australia that he can turn it around going into the South Africa series. Obviously for Cameron Green, he's a very exciting prospect, very exciting talent, and hopefully we can see the best of Cameron Green in the South Africa series. Alex Carey had a pretty good second Test match. He didn't really have much opportunities with the bat throughout the series. Obviously Australia's top order was dominating, so him and Cameron Green didn't have much time in the middle, but the second Test match for Carey was a pretty good Test match in terms of the batting side of things, scoring 41 not out in the first innings, but also with the gloves. In the second innings of the second Test, he got 6 catches and 2 brilliant catches up close to the stumps off Michael Ness's bowling. So that's good signs for Carey that his keeping's improving and also his batting's improving as well. So he will be quite pleased with his performance in the second Test, and probably will gain a lot of confidence from this going forward to the South Africa series. So once again, overall, it was a pretty good batting performance from Australia. Pretty dominant batting performance. I can't really add anything else to it, really, because it was just a good batting performance. But it's good signs going into the South Africa series that all the batters are scoring runs and Australia look pretty good. Can they build this momentum into the South Africa series? That will be another question. South Africa will pose a lot of different challenges to Australia. But, for Australia, they'll be pleased with how they batted in this series. They'll be looking at ways to improve and get better. But overall, it was a dominant batting display from Australia in this Test series against the West Indies. Let's have a look at the Australian bowlers and their performance in this Test series with the ball against the West Indies. Leading wicket taker for Australia in the series was Nathan Lyon with 12 wickets, Stark 9, Nessa 5, 3 wickets for Cummins and Boland, 2 wickets each for Head, Hazlewood and Green. That's how the Australian bowlers went about things with the ball in this Test series against the West Indies. Australia's bowling in this series was top class, and you expect that from a quality attack that have all taken 200 plus Test wickets in Lyon, Stark, Cummins and Hazlewood. Australia were able to take 20 wickets and bowl the West Indies out for low scores throughout the series. In the first Test match, 283 and 333. The second Test, 214 and 77. So that just shows you that Australia's bowling was pretty good. They did the basics well with the ball throughout the whole series. They built pressure with the ball. They bowled dot balls and maidens. Very important to build that pressure in Test cricket, which that pressure was applied to the West Indian batters, and the West Indian batters could not respond with that pressure being built upon them by the Australian bowlers. They executed their plans and skills of the ball nicely, Australia. They bowled consistent lines and lengths and were relentless in their lines and lengths and pressure. And nothing more to add on to that, really. It was a dominant display. And you'll expect that from a quality attack of Lyon, Stark, Cummins and Hazlewood. But also other bowlers like Michael Nessa and Scott Boland coming in to replace Cummins and Hazlewood for the second Test match in Adelaide. They come in and do a job and perform well. So this Australian bowling attack, you have the main attack of Lyon, Stark, Cummins and Hazlewood, obviously. But the bowlers coming underneath the second string attack in Boland and Nessa come into the side for the second Test in Adelaide, as I mentioned, and do a job and perform well and take wickets. So it's a very good Australian attack. They're bowling well, good rhythm, everyone's doing their job, they're all taking wickets, they're all contributing, and we saw that throughout this series against the West Indies. So all good signs for the Australian bowlers going into the Test series against South Africa, that all the bowlers are firing, they're peaking at the right time, just like the batters, peaking at the right time, taking wickets, bowling well, bowling with rhythm, and really at peace with their plans and really their games, really. And it was just dominant bowling performance. Nothing more to add on to it. I've run out of superlatives to describe the Australian bowling performance in this series against the West Indies. But it was very clinical, and you'll expect that from a top quality attack. And that's why this Australian attack is probably one of the best attacks in the world. And they'll come against another good attack in world cricket, and that's the South African pace attack in the Test series against South Africa. But going back on to this series, pretty good performance from Australia. Absolutely clinical. Everyone did their job. Everyone contributed. Everyone got a wicket or two in both of the Test matches and really did their job. So overall, it was a dominant bowling display from Australia in this Test series against the West Indies. Let's have a look at the West Indies' performance with both bat and ball in this Test series against Australia and talk about their performance in the Test series overall. A tough series for the West Indies. Struggled throughout the 2 Test matches and were outplayed in all 3 departments with bat, ball and in the field. But they will gain a lot from this tour of Australia. And they will be back to Australia very soon, next summer in fact, to play 2 Test matches, 3 ODIs and 3 T20 internationals. So, for the West Indies, they come back to Australia in a year's time. Are we going to see a different West Indian team to the team that they played in this Test series against Australia in 2022-2023? Those will be the questions that the West Indies will have to ask themselves going forward as a test side. It was a very tough series for the West Indies. We expected the West Indies to struggle. We expected Australia to win the series 2-0, and that's what has happened. But for the West Indies, their batting and bowling really lacking the quality compared to Australia. Their batting and bowling's high class and quality, whereas the West Indian batting and bowling, you can see the gap between the quality and the class up against Australia. It was definitely lacking. And in the way that they batted and bowled throughout the series, you could see that. Let's talk about the batting. Leading run scorer for the West Indies was the captain, Craig Braithwaite, with 196 runs. Chandipal with 160, Blackwood 63, Brooks 52, De Silva 50, Holder 41, Thomas 31, Bonner 16, and Mayers 11. And that's how the West Indian batters performed in this test series against Australia. The West Indies batting was poor and underwhelming in this series. Didn't do the basics well with the bat, didn't build partnerships, didn't run well between the wickets. We saw a couple of run-outs in the second test in Adelaide. Didn't put pressure back onto the Australian bowlers, poor shot selection, and not doing the 1%ers right. And that was the big difference in this series, that with the West Indian batting, they just didn't do the basics right. You have a look at Australia's batting, the Australian batters did the basics right. They did the basics well. Compare that to the West Indian batters, unfortunately they weren't able to do the basics well with the bat throughout this whole entire series. The West Indies, their partnerships throughout this series with the bat, there was only one 100-run partnership, and that came in the first test with Braithwaite and Chandipal for the first wicket of 116. But throughout this series, they had only 5 50-run partnerships out of the 2 test matches, and one 100-run partnership, as we mentioned before. So in the first test, they had partnerships of 116, as we mentioned, 82, 78, 58, and 53. And in the second test, they only had one 50-run partnership, and that was in the first innings with 60, and that was Anderson Phillip and Joshua Silva for the 7th wicket. So that's an indication of the West Indian batting as well, is that they didn't build big partnerships. Australia were able to build big partnerships and were able to convert 50-run partnerships into big partnerships. For the West Indies, they weren't able to do that. So not too many big partnerships at all from the West Indian point of view with the bat. They weren't able to build partnerships consistently throughout the series. And also in the way that the West Indies scored their runs in terms of their team totals throughout the 2 test matches, it's an indication of where they're at as a batting group. The first test match, they showed a lot of fight, resistance, resilience. They were able to take the first test match into the second session on day 5. 283 in 98.2 overs and 333 in 110.5 overs in the first test in Perth was not a bad effort. It was a reasonable effort, and they were able to get that test match into day 5, second session. The test match in Adelaide, they sort of went backwards. 214 all out, 69.3 overs, and 77 all out in 40.5 overs in the second innings was a bit of an indication of their batting and where they're at as a batting group. And it just pretty much sums up West Indies cricket at the moment in terms of their test side of things. They're struggling in one-day cricket and also T20 cricket as well. But with the test side, they are struggling with their batting and bowling, and you could see that. So looking at those numbers and stats, it's a reflection of how they're batting, how they went about things with the bat, and at the end of the day, Australia were just better in terms of the quality and class of their batting and bowling. The only positives for the West Indies in this series was Chandipal. I thought Tagnaran Chandipal batted really well, averaging 40 in the series, got a half century in Perth. He took it to the Australian bowlers. He wasn't afraid. He didn't take a backward step. Australia were bowling a lot of short balls to him in Perth and in Adelaide, but he took on the pull and hook shot, and he was able to get some runs off of it as well. He got hit a few times in the first test in Perth. He got back up. He went about his business. He's got that fighting characteristic like his father had, Shivran Chanderpaul. So it does run in the family, father and son. But Chanderpaul, he's definitely a big positive for the West Indies. I think he's the only positive out of the batting performance throughout the series of the West Indies. He's got a lot of promise. He's got a lot of potential. He's got the talent. He's got the technique. He's got a wonderful mentor to look up to in his father, in Shivran Chanderpaul. So he's one of the positives for the West Indies. And I think the West Indies have found an opening batter in this series in Tagnarayan Chanderpaul. The other positive is Craig Braithwaite, the captain. 196 runs in the series. Scored a brilliant century in Perth, 110. And I think him and Chanderpaul, the opening partnership that they had in this series, is probably an opening partnership that will probably last a long time for the West Indies going forward in Test cricket. Both of them seem to play similar styles of cricket in terms of the way they bat. Two very determined openers, putting a high price on their wicket. So I think that's a real positive from the West Indies in this series. But apart from that, nothing much to add on, really. All the other batters were underwhelming and disappointing. Just didn't do the basics well enough, the West Indies, with the bat throughout the series. So overall, it was a poor batting performance from the West Indies in this Test series against Australia. Let's have a look at the West Indies bowlers and their performance in this Test series against Australia. Asari Joseph was the leading wicket taker for the West Indies in the series with 5. 3 wickets for Chase, 2 wickets for Thomas, and a wicket each for Mayers, Seals, Roach, Phillip, and Holder. That's how the West Indian bowlers went about things in this Test series with the ball against Australia. Now, the West Indies bowling was poor in this series, couldn't take 20 wickets, and didn't bowl Australia out once in this series. Australia declared all 4 innings they batted in the whole entire series. The West Indies conceded big scores with the ball. Australia were able to score big runs. The first Test match, 4 for 598 declared and 2 for 182 declared. The second Test, 7 for 511 declared and 6 for 199 declared. So that's an indication that the West Indian bowlers didn't bowl well. Australia were able to score runs at will and were able to score big totals in the first innings and also do well in the second innings as well. So you've got to take 20 wickets in Australia. That's the only way you're going to put Australia under pressure in these conditions. Unfortunately for the West Indies, they couldn't do that. They couldn't take 20 wickets and couldn't bowl Australia out, which is a real concern because you need to take 20 wickets in Australia, especially against Australia, to put them under pressure. And unfortunately, the West Indies just couldn't do that. The West Indies didn't do the basics well with the ball. They didn't build pressure with the ball. They didn't bowl consistent lines and lengths with the ball. Didn't execute their plans or skills with the ball. They didn't build pressure with dot balls and maidens. They didn't do that consistently. So for the West Indies, they just didn't do the basics well with the ball at times. And we saw that throughout the whole series. I think for the West Indies, what they were lacking in this series was that they need a bit more pace in the pace attack to be effective in Australian conditions. Now, here in Australia on these flat wickets that are good for batting, you need someone who can bowl 140 plus up towards 150. The only one in this West Indian bowling attack that can do that, bowl 140 plus, is Asari Joseph. He took 5 wickets for the series. We saw him bowl well in Perth when he bowled in the second innings to Marnus Labuschagne, bowled him short balls. Marnus was hopping around all over the crease, didn't look comfortable. But Asari Joseph was a bit inconsistent in this series, and he was the main strike bowler for the West Indies. But he wasn't really threatening throughout the 2 Test matches. Only the time he bounced Labuschagne in Perth, he looked threatening. The second Test in Adelaide, he had a bit of a different role because he was bowling with the new ball. Kemar Roach was out because of injury. He couldn't be the intimidator or bowl the short balls like he did in Perth in the second innings to Labuschagne. Couldn't do that in Adelaide because he was bowling with the new ball. So different role for him. But for the West Indies, they need extra pace. They need extra pace to be threatening, to be potent in Australian conditions. All the other bowlers were medium paces, and some of them bowled high 130s up towards 140. But there's a big difference bowling that sort of speed to bowling 140 plus up towards 150. Also, they were lacking a quality spinner. Roston Chase was underwhelming. Pretty poor series from him. Roston Chase is not a frontline spinner. And he isn't, because he's a batter who can bowl a bit of off spin. So they were lacking a quality spinner as well in the series. Roston Chase wasn't able to build pressure. He wasn't able to take wickets at regular intervals throughout the 2 test matches to really help out the other bowlers. Nathan Lyon does that well with Australia, because Nathan Lyon's a quality spinner who's taken 450 test wickets now, and he knows how to bowl off spin in Australia. It's a very hard place to bowl finger spin in Australia, where the pitches don't really do much. Where Nathan Lyon's greatest asset and strength is his revolutions in the ball, his pace, changing it up, his trajectory, his lines, his lengths, and that's why he's got a lot of success in Australia. Roston Chase, throughout the whole series, wasn't able to build pressure. He was leaking runs like a sieve. He wasn't building pressure, and that put pressure back on to the West Indian bowlers. And then Braithwaite, Craig Braithwaite, the captain, had to bowl himself at times. Now, is that probably an indication that he doesn't trust Chase, and he thinks, well, I've got to bowl some overs here to really compensate for Chase's expensive overs. So they were lacking a quality spinner. So for the West Indies, they come back to Australia next year, of course, to play 2 test matches again. Also, they're going to play 3 ODIs and 3 T20s. They've got to think about extra pace and a quality spinner in their bowling lineup when they come back to Australia for the next tour, which is next year. Because the only way they're going to have success is they've got to have bowlers who can bowl pace, quality spinner who can help out the quicks and take wickets and build pressure. But their bowling throughout this whole series was poor, underwhelming, didn't do the basics well, and you could see that. Compared to Australia's bowling, Australia did the basics well. There's quality, class there. Cummins, Stark, Hazelwood and Lyon have got 200 plus test wickets. So the West Indies, they don't have that. So a very big gap between the 2 bowling units in this test series. So overall, it was a poor bowling performance from the West Indies in this test series against Australia. It was a dominant performance from Australia in this test series against the West Indies. They will be pleased with their 2-0 series win, and they have retained the Sir Frank Worrell Trophy for another series. This series win has set them up nicely for the test series against South Africa. For the West Indies, it was a tough test series, but they will gain a lot from this tour to Australia. But they can gain some positives from this series. For example, young Tagdarine Chanderpaul. They've found an opening batter for the future. Hopefully the West Indies can improve as a test side when they come back to Australia next year, when they play 2 tests, 3 ODIs and 3 T20 internationals. Well, that's all the time we have for this episode. Be sure to subscribe and click the bell to get the latest episodes of the podcast, and like and share our Facebook page, and follow us on Twitter and on Instagram. Until next time, keep safe, and bye for now.